Hello. I'm very glad to open up the next panel here in our discussions, which is called Soul Landscapes. The theme definitely very important to when thinking about the exhibition here about the Baltic symbolism and for the Baltic authors. And I'm very happy to introduce here Thor Mednick, who is an associate professor of art history at the University of Toledo. And as an art historian, he has been specializing in 19th century European art, focusing on Denmark and Scandinavia. He has been a co-editor also for a very extensive volume of the Symbolist Roots of Modern Art, published in 2015, and also recently curated an exhibition of 19th century Danish landscape called Down to Earth. And today we are listening here a very exciting presentation about the comparison between Paul Raud and Danish Ejnar Nielsen, and paper is entitled as Intuition and Autonomy in the works of Ejnar Nielsen and Paul Raud. So, Thor Mednick, you're very welcome.
Great. Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. I'm really, it's an honor to be here with all of you. I'm very pleased. Thanks for inviting me. When I was constructing this title slide, I very nearly included a question mark as such. Because while it is my plan to discuss a bit of Paul Raud's work today, as an interloper in things Estonian, I'll do so relatively briefly in comparison to Nielsen, and also quite speculatively. It was when Bart Pushaw made me aware of these images that a potential comparison between Raud and Nielsen began to emerge for me. And I was particularly interested in the visual contrasts between these two paintings from more or less the same period. Raud's apparent wavering between his sort of realist training on the left and his slightly flatter and more decorative style, the style that Mai Lieven, for instance, has discussed in terms of sort of Jugendstil symbolism, on the right brings to my mind a similar tendency in Nielsen's work from this period. I'll start with this one. This is a staggering work. When encountering it in its rather prominent place in the National Gallery in Copenhagen, one is immediately absorbed, or at least I am, by its morbid despair, by its colors, which are so sickly, so decayed and decomposed, by its walls, which are so thick and bare and so terribly closed. It's hard to say whether it is the room or the figure that looks worse, and it doesn't really matter much because the whole idea of an animating life force it doesn't occupy this space and probably won't any time in the near future. And then there's the man, looking at nothingness, but with eyes open because closing them would only make it worse. Right? If one stands at an oblique angle to the picture plane, it is possible to look straight into his eyes. And it's difficult not to, actually. And from that position, strange things occur. One's mind is alive with empathy and compassion, and yet one is held in place because the scene is so terribly static. An interesting thing here is that one of the painting's primary subjects, that is death, is entirely and only an implied presence. In a painting about seeing death, death is actually nowhere to be seen. Of course, the title indicates that it's a past event, but even then, the original sighting was not of a physical death. When the eye of the title saw death, it was not in the world, it was in a pair of eyes. We're not meant to see it as an embodied phenomenon, and yet it is present. And we are told where to look for it. It is, again, in his eyes. It is in his eyes as a memory, as a threat, as a pall that lingers to torment his psyche. Just whom the I and the his of the title refer to is a matter for another time, but what we have for now is a pair of eyes that have seen something that is not materially on the canvas for us to see. And it's either the same thing, or perhaps it's just the reverse, that occurs in this painting. Here the eyes are gone, that is, blind. And what we're shown is a materially represented projection of the mind. That is, its own creation of an image based on a much more distant memory, and I'll explain that in a moment. The blind girl is probably the most reproduced of Nielsen's paintings, and certainly one of the most, or the one that is most often referred to when a single example of his symbolism is required. This is primarily due to the stylization of the landscape. First of all, there is a slightly flattened quality to the pictorial space. Space does recede, but it does so unevenly, and it often gives way to a sort of synthetist flattening, as with the trees in the middle ground, and the river that snakes like a sort of meandering golden pavement behind her. Also significant for the symbolist reading of this work is the state of blindness itself, which enjoyed an evocative resonance amongst those symbolists who valued the deeper truth of the unseen over illusory distractions of reality. In the words of the Danish writer Johannes Jansen, for instance, the symbolist artist, quote, feels his soul's connection with the soul of nature and perceives behind the apparent neutrality of things a secret world where his spirit is an eternal citizen. Reality is for him only a symbol of a higher world, close quote. Other symbolist literary figures, such as Belgian poet, philosopher, and playwright Maurice Maeterlinck, were similarly taken with this viewpoint. Maeterlinck wrote a gripping experimental play called The Blind in 1891, which appeared in a successful Danish translation in that same year, and in an earlier poem entitled Instinct, he had declared that one must close one's eyes to see clearly. An echo of the Swedish theologian Emanuel Swedenborg, whose later texts on Christian mysticism enjoyed a renewed currency amongst the symbolists, has also been identified in this painting. Art historian Sasha Newman, for instance, has speculated on the possible relation of Nielsen's The Blind Girl to Swedenborg's notion of second sight, in which, as Newman explains, quote, one must lose one's awareness of material surroundings in order to see across great distances of time and space into the soul and divinity, close quote. The interest in blindness may also have represented some residue of the romantic fascination with darkness in general. Wagner delved into the psychological moods of darkness on more than one occasion. For instance, much of Tristan and Isolde, for much of that opera, Tristan is torn by a sort of a furious regret that he might have missed his last chance for Isolde. More than once, he berates the daylight for having illuminated only the obstacles in his way and expresses relief in the night and its clear seeing. In Act 2, Scene 2, he declares, quote, from the picture within my heart's secret shrine, gone was the lying glitter of the day. My eyes, used to the darkness, now could perceive it truly, close quote. And then again later, furiously, quote, the daylight, to the treacherous daylight, my bitterest foe laments and loathing, close quote. Whether or not there was a direct influence, Maeterlinck certainly shared this general belief in the evocative power of darkness. In 1915, literary critic MacDonald Clark noted Maeterlinck's tendency to set his scenes at the darker times of day. As Clark states, quote, "This avoidance of brilliant sunlight, this preference for moonlit or shadowy solitudes, produces the effect of a dream rather than reality, of a curious subconsciousness rather than full everyday consciousness," close quote. Seems to me that the secret shrine of Tristan's heart and the effect of subconsciousness that Clark describes in Maeterlinck relate quite interestingly to Nielsen's project, both in And in His Eyes I Saw Death, the image I opened with, and The Blind Girl. I referred before to the landscape in this picture as the projection by the blind girl's mind of an image created from a distant memory. The model for the blind girl was a woman named Dagmar Andersson, who had lost her sight permanently at the age of 7 from an untreatable eye infection. She remained in her rural home of Gatn in Jutland, where this is painted, where she eventually learned to play the organ and held the job of church organist until her death. Nielsen portrayed Dagmar many times, including in one fascinating work entitled The Blind Girl's View, here at the bottom center, in which Nielsen shows us the view from Dagmar's chambers in the church where she played organ every Sunday. This image interests me particularly as an example of the dual representation, the commingling of material and immaterial points of reference that often seems to be at play in Nielsen's figural works. Nielsen has given us Dagmar only without embodying her. She is present, it is her view, she is the blind girl of the title, but Nielsen has reduced her to a representation of her blindness. She is evoked in a sight that her own eyes can no longer see, no longer capture. In a sense, the blind girl's view, in the blind girl's view, Dagmar is embodied by us, who can see that which is before her every day. By witnessing her view from the window, we become Dagmar, and yet we can't really become her because we see with our eyes, whereas she sees with something else. Writings on this painting take it in short to be a symbolist landscape, or rather a symbolist painting, excuse me, of a girl in a landscape. The assumption is that this is a stylized painting of a real landscape, and that assumption is encouraged by the fact that it is plausible as a landscape in the area of Gatn. One can find views similar to this in photographs and paintings of Gatn by other artists. And importantly, the blind girl is identifiable as Dagmar Andersson, who lived in Gatn and who could easily have been found traversing a landscape such as this one. In addition to noting the synthesist tendencies that I summarized before, scholars have often described this landscape as divided by this first line of trees here in the middle ground, into the world of the real in the foreground and the world of the spiritual infinite in the background. The golden river, the golden sky, and the paired lambs are seen as references to the continuum of paradise. The girl, in turn, is seen as simultaneously grounded in the world of the real, where she stands, and in transcendence of it, in her symbolic contact with the other world, which frames her from the waist up. In this construction, the dandelion she holds in her hand becomes a sort of poignant symbol for the heightened sensitivity of her non-visual senses. According to this interpretation, then, the perception of symbolist practice applies both to the landscape and to Dagmar equally. The trouble for me is that this reading is predicated on the assumption that Dagmar and the landscape are equally real objects, both of which are subject in this painting to Nielsen's symbolist depiction. It seems to me that there are certain incongruities in this work that agitate against that view. To begin with, she is simply too large for the setting. She's both too wide and too tall. More important than this, though, are the inconsistencies between how Nielsen paints her versus how he paints the landscape. The components of her form, especially her face and hands, but also her dress, are not given the same reductive treatment as many of the forms around her. There is a respectful care in Nielsen's handling of her face, in the shadows of her lips, in the creases of her mandible and cheeks. The hairs on the side of her head are individuated, and her long organist's fingers are finely described, from the wrinkles of her knuckles to the little marks of wear on her nails. Her dress, although very nearly as dark as the trees behind her, is nevertheless articulated quite clearly in all of its seams and pleats. I realize this is not an ideal reproduction of the painting, but in person it's there. It's very clearly articulated. Nowhere else in the painting does Nielsen ascend to anything approximating this level of detail. Notice also that the light that illuminates her and reflects softly off her forehead and nose is not the same universal light that falls over the scene behind her. Most remarkable here is the clarity with which Nielsen delineates her figure. Whereas the trees seem like blobs of paint that have gradually sort of spread to their current breadth, there is an unmistakable outline around her. She's not enveloped by the atmosphere of the landscape behind her. She does not occupy the same space. She is set apart from it quite sharply, as though she were standing in front of a picture, or in front of a screen against which a picture was being projected. Whereas Dagmar is in the real world, as it were, the landscape is not. What we are seeing strikes me as a representation of Dagmar's memory. She went blind 15 years before this picture was painted. What remains is that young girl's impression of her native landscape, an impression brought back to her mind's eye, by the familiar sensation of the dandelion in her hand. Indeed, the dandelion may also symbolize the fleeting nature of the visual stimulus it recalls for her. It's not the landscape per se that is symbolist in this painting, but Dagmar's inner vision of it. It is the representation that her psyche retains based on a memory that is 15 years old. What I wonder is whether a similar tension between the awareness of occupied space and the memory of what that space used to signify might not also go some way to explaining what's going on in these two images. For while Raud's depiction of his mother, not just here, but also across the decade represented in these three views, is deeply invested with a respect for what he sees as she sits before him, the depiction of Rakvere is where he used to reside, seems infused with another kind or nature of visual presence. The variety of finish here and the sense of objects fading in and out of their own materiality could very well be expressions of an inclination toward the idiom of symbolism, but I wonder if they might also express the dual resonance of this image within Rauda's mind, as the place that he at once sees and remembers. And the fact that it is a cemetery we are seeing might here also suggest the participation of other lingering memories with his, and for that matter, with ours. I think of these two images as what I call psychographic pictures. It seems to me that in works such as these, Nielsen is representing a phenomenon that was widely discussed by aesthetic philosophers in the Romantic period, a sort of emulating mechanism in the human mind, which had the capacity to record encountered stimuli and report them back in an enhanced or otherwise altered version. Emulating because the mechanism did not simply function as a mirror, it was a locus of creativity. In 1831, the German natural philosopher Carl Gustav Carus published a series of epistolary essays on art under the title 9 Letters on Landscape Painting. Perhaps typically for a mind so widely curious as his, Carus was quite broad and loose in his terminology. What I previously described as, or identified as the emulating mechanism appears in Carus variously as the spirit or the mind or the conscious or the unconscious, depending on function and context. Whatever he happened to call it, it is clear that he believed it to be at the heart of artistic creativity, most especially as applied to landscape painting. It was also central in the debate around the validity of landscape painting as a genre that developed in the late 18th century. Briefly, I'm sure that you're familiar with this, but I'll just summarize it very briefly. The argument was between, on the one hand, drawing, that is the simple mechanical and literal reporting of a visual scene, and on the other hand, painting, that is the creation of a picture with a greater impact than the mere sum of its parts. In his fourth discourse on art in 1771, Joshua Reynolds insisted that it was the responsibility of the artist not to record but to improve on nature. Pierre-Henri de Valenciennes, writing in 1800, annotated this imperative with the observation that the improvement, the greater spiritual value in a landscape painting was necessarily the contribution of the artist's own mind. The emulating mechanism, if you will, which transcended simple vision. And it was here that Carus entered the debate, and he did it by offering an important observation. To begin, Carus posited that the improvement in a landscape painting to which Valenciennes referred constituted a glimpse into the soul and spirit of nature. The best and highest use of art was to reveal the harmonic totality, the divine inspiration of the natural subject. Art, said Carus, quote, brings us to the primal power and the soul of the universe, which as a whole remains beyond human understanding and makes it known to us through one of its particles, close quote. What must be understood is that, according to Carus, that particle of the universe, which would indicate the harmonious whole, was the human mind itself. The reasoning was essentially syllogistic. If the improvement to which Valenciennes referred appears only when the visual facts of nature are processed through the emulating mechanism of the human mind, then it is the human mind that provides the transcendent quality in a landscape painting. And if the transcendent quality in a landscape painting is a reflection of the power and soul of the universe, then the human mind must a priori be in some sort of contact with that realm. As Carus noted, quote, the work of art must never adhere too closely to nature, but must rise above it. For if we ever forget that this is the work of the human spirit, art will lose its human reference. The creations of art testify to the kinship between man and the world spirit, close quote. In this sense, the work of art also becomes the visual mode for communicating the artist's contact with the world spirit or universe, and the human psyche in the observer, also capable of this contact, becomes the mechanism that receives it. There is one additional point to make. Insofar as the human mind is subject to moods, as Carus explained, the work of art is also, quote, an utterance and a metaphor for the psychic state as a whole, which can truly hold a mirror up to the mind, close quote. And the observer, with a mind and psyche of her own, is equipped to receive this reflection intuitively, without the need for concrete devices of explanation. This is, I think, the application to Nielsen, whose work not only intimates the presence of an unspoken communication, but in examples such as these actually conditions the meaning on our participation in that exchange. At some point, it is we who see death in his eyes, and we will carry the memory of that moment and share it with the others who come after. I am tempted to wonder about the possibility of a comparable presence here, a parallel reality of intuitive communication that reverberates in something other than what we see. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We are now proceeding with an exciting paper by Vibeke Waallann Hansen, and the talk will be about Edvard Munch, entitled A Walk in the Forest with Edvard Munch, Symbolist Landscape. About Vibeke Waallann Hansen, also brief words. She got her master's degree in art history in the University of Oslo, and she worked as a curator of exhibitions and collections at the National Museum of Art in Oslo. And she's a great specialist of modern Norwegian art. And her other interests are European art from the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries, early modernism, and Nordic art in general. So, Vibeke? Yes.
Yes, I just say the same as the others. Thank you for being invited and taking part in this very interesting conference. So, I think my paper has changed a little bit since I made my abstract, but so it's not so much in general about the forest in Symbolist artworks, but maybe we can come back to that in the talk afterwards. So it's more about Edvard Munch and his, especially his painting Ashes. In 2017, the Munch Museum in Oslo held an exhibition named after a woodcut from 1897 by Edvard Munch towards the forest, as you can see here behind me. It was a great exhibition, but despite the title, it wasn't really about the forest as a topic in Munch's art. However, it intrigued me to think further about Munch and the forest. Those of you who are familiar with his art will know that many of the most famous paintings, in many of his most famous paintings, the dialogue between figures and nature are essential. Both the seashore and the forest are well represented. The Norwegian mountains that was so popular in a generation before him, actually he left out. Especially the curving shoreline have become iconic. But what about the forest and trees? What is it to say about that? I will here reflect upon the forest as a motive and metaphor by focusing on Ashes from 1895. There. As you know, Europe is one of the world's most forest-rich regions, and much of the forest is to be found in the Baltic Sea region and the countries nearby, such as Russia and Norway. And the Polish author Stanisław Przybysewski, he touched upon this actually when he, in a text about the Norwegian sculptor Gustav Vigeland in 1896. And he gives the following introduction to Vigeland's home country. You can see the quote here. Norway is the land of the bright nights, the land of mountains and the sea, and the land of awful seriousness and heavy oppressive melancholy, the most tragic country in Europe. The scarce soil produced by the mountains, crumbling over millions of years, had been washed by glaciers down and across the sea to the fertile Frisia and the Netherlands. Another desperate attempt was made, and again a tiny amount of soil appeared, soon overgrown by forests, by limitless forest, Norway's sole natural resource. Przybysewski gives a kind of evolutionary geographical description of Norway. It is quite a pessimistic view, I have to say. Europe's most tragic country. I don't know if that could pass as a description of nowadays Norway, actually. However, the landscape hasn't changed much. It is the land of mountains and the sea and the forest. Przybysewski also wrote about Edvard Munch's art in the 90s, and I will come back to that a little bit later. In the 1890s, Munch painted a few pure landscape paintings. It was not until 1900 that the pure landscape became a major preoccupation. During the 90s, his specialty became to transform pastoral elements and figures into psychological statements, which I think Ashes exemplifies very well. You see here a painting from 1891-92, the Pine Forest. And this is an example of how he worked with landscape scenes in a naturalistic and, or let's say, impressionistic way until the beginning of the 1890s. A short time after he executed the Pine Forest, something new and different occurred in his landscape renderings. Here we see forest interior and moonlight on the beach. They are both from 1892. Here we can see he, in a way, zooms in on details like stones, tree trunks, and the forest ground instead of giving a view of the infinite nature. And he also experiments with syntheticism. Comparing the earlier pine forest with these two images, I come to think that he, at this moment, was searching for some kind of new visuality. One could say that these are mental instead of ocular images, conceptions instead of perception of nature. The forms are simplified, things are fixed rather than in motion, and flat rather than in three-dimensional. These two paintings, The Forest Interior and Moonlight on the Beach, introduces the shoreline and the trees and the forest, which is to become the leitmotif in Munch's Frieze of Life. Throughout the Frieze of Life, to which he devoted his major energies during the 1890s, in this exploration of man's psychology and attempt to express something about human feelings, the forest and the trees are essential, especially in his staging of the relation between man and woman. Forest Interior is most probably a sketch for Ashes, which he made in 1894 or 95. Both paintings were shown for the first time in an exhibition in the Ashes and the Forest Interior were both shown in an exhibition in Christiania in 1895. However, between the Forest Interior, which is probably a sketch for Ashes, and Ashes, Munch painted Summer Night, The Voice. Here, he for the first time combines and conceptualizes the elements which are so essential in so many of his 1890s paintings: trees, forest, the moon. Actually, in Norway we say månesøyle. I don't know if there is I think we have invented a new word because of Munch. I don't know if we can say moon pillar in this special figure of the moon behind here. Maybe you can say moon pillar in English as well, I don't know. The shoreline and the frontality of the figures. These are the characteristic traits. There are some interesting similarities between the Voice and Émile Bernard's 1888 painting, Madeleine in the Bois d'Amour. They present for us a young woman alone surrounded by trees. Both girls are enclosed in a forest. Is it maybe the forest of love in both cases? Przybylewski wrote about Munch's The Voice that he here found a mood of yearning that comes with puberty. And he saw an expression of sexual arousal and compared the young girl with the poet Richard Demel's Venus Andamyona. Difficult word to say. In the Ashes, the emotional drama unfolds in a deep, dark forest. A man with a greenish-gray face is sitting crouched in one corner of the painting. A woman with an open dress, revealing her red undergarment, stands right behind him. The man seems to have failed to suppress his desire for the woman, and something that should not have happened did maybe happen. But why did Munch stage the couple in a forest? I think we can find part of the answer by looking into literature, and in addition to the contemporary literature, we might also find something of interest in Norwegian folklore. The literary focus of Munch's art from the 1890s is evident. Like with much other symbolist art, his paintings often conceal multiple hidden meanings and connections with literature, as well as it is related to the artist's own psyche. His ability to create a pictorial paraphrase for a verbal expression was one of his principal gifts and reminds us that his associations were quite as intimate with writers as with artists. When studying some of his drawings and other paintings made about the same time as Ashes, we can see that mythological figures were something that occupied him. For instance, we find both drawings and paintings showing mermaids. A series of drawings called The First Humans is highly interesting in relation to both Ashes and the woodcut towards the forest. In one of these drawings, we see a woman and a man holding each other tightly, and they are on their way into a dense, dark forest. The artist is here dealing with some kind of primeval myth, I think. The couple walking towards the forest are in harmony with each other. Compared to the woodcut, the drawing is more realistic, and the forest is dominating the composition. In the woodcut, the couple is in the front, the woman is naked, while the man is wearing a suit. And I'm now referring to the woodcut that you saw on the first slide. The forest in, yeah, actually I have it here also. The forest in this image is highly stylized and just slightly suggested. In one of the other drawings from the series, The First Humans, we see a man violently attacking a Medusa-like head. Is he maybe drowning her? Medusa is a character Munch also refers to in his own writings. There are also a couple of sketches and lithographic versions related to ashes. They differed slightly from the painting, but what binds all these images together are that the actions are all staged in a forest. Once more, I will return to Stanislaw Przybysewski. He wrote a text about Munch in 1894, where he points out the searching for the irrational in Munch's art. Quote, Munch is the first to have attempted to depict the finest and most subtle movements of the soul. His pictures are fixed at the moment when all the voices of rationality have fallen silent, when all mental activity has ceased. They are specimens of the soul as animal, the reasonless soul captured as it twists, as it swirls up tempestuously, as it sinks into states of gloomy semi-existence, as it screams in paroxysms of pain, as it howls with hunger. We can say that the forest in ashes represents the absence of rationality and is a setting that signals the human primal condition. Here in the deep dark forest, they are dominated by their instincts. The couple are separated from the social life in the city, and they are sheltered in the forest. No one can see them. The flowering and passing of love, as we see it in ashes, takes place in the wilderness. One of the painting's alternative titles is After the Fall, and this offers a biblical interpretation. This could mean that we are looking at Adam and Eve and that the topic is guilt and lost paradise. To use the story of Adam and Eve in a new context was, as you know, quite common at this time. One of Munch's Norwegian colleagues, Hans Heyerdahl, made the painting that you see here from 1877. According to Munch himself, Heyerdahl was in general an important inspiration to him. Heyerdahl, many years later, in 1990, painted this nymph, which have a striking resemblance with the female figure in ashes. Gerhard Munthe also dealt with mythology, folk songs, and fairy figures. Here we see one of his, at that time, well-known watercolors, Black Apples. The style is obviously very different from Munch, but the framing of the motif has some interesting parallel to ashes, so do the topic. Yeah. Myths, fairy tales, legend, and mythological figures from a, I think I go back to the ashes so we can look more at that. Myth, fairy tales, legends, and mythological figures from a folkloristic tradition was highly topical in Norway in the 1890s, both among writers and artists. One of the most common mythological figures in Norwegian folklore was Huldra. She is what you could call in English a wood nymph. In historical times, Huldra was sometimes used as a symbol for or personalization of the Norwegian forest in general. The mystic, dark, and secretive pine forest is where she belongs. Huldra was described as exceptionally beautiful and was said to spellbound young boys that happened to meet this creature in the deep, dark forest. Huldra also symbolizes promises that were broken or happiness and love that can never be achieved. Munch might have been influenced by such mythological stories in addition to more common European Medusa, Adam and Eve, and what we saw in his drawings. In romantic poetry, such beings as nymphs and wood nymphs and so on can also embody the irrational and emotional, as well as appear as the messenger of the subconscious. A recurrent theme in romantic poetry is the encounter between a human male figure and a fairy figure. The story goes that such a confrontation often leaves the man changed, marked for life. He becomes a shadow of his socially integrated I. Such a meeting stands for the break of the limit of empirical knowledge and rational action. In the Norwegian folk poetry, descriptions of nature are essential. The humans and the mythological figures are usually described in a way that closely integrates them into nature. In Munch's own writings, we can also find examples where he intertwines descriptions of nature, a woman, and feelings. Here is one example from his notebook, 1889-91 is the date, and I have translated them myself, so sorry if it's really bad translation, but I try. So this is quotation from Munch himself. In the evening, the bright night turned darker in the forest. Her eyes became big, mystic, and the voice went slower and softer. Then we went out of the forest towards the beach, where the bright summer night showed up in all its glory, the golden horizon sparkling gold. And there I was looking at her. What a transformation. We also find text that describes, in Munch's notebook, from the same period, text that describes the meeting of a male and a female, and where this meeting is related to the forest. A new quotation. When I am out a bright summer night and the moon is rising, then I see you with your lovely smile and your blue faithful eyes. Then I dream of taking your hand and that the two of us walk into the sultry, humid forest. And there we are alone, you and me. And there's another, one more quotation. Then they came into the forest. On one side there was thick forest, black, dark, and impenetrable. On the other side, the blue ocean. They looked into the forest. See how strange and dark there is, said Miss Heiberg. So here he used some names, and so it's kind of a dialogue. And Silence said Brandt, that's the male character. Maybe sultry. It could be nice to stay in a tent within such a forest during the summer. Not alone, said Miss Heiberg. With one that one loved, and they walked further in. Henrik Ibsen also used references to folk poetry in some of his writings, for instance in his play Olav Liljekrans, Midsummer's Eve, and Peer Gynt. Ibsen used supernatural figures and legends to create literary images telling about common human feelings. The persons sometimes express themselves in the language of the romantic ballads and poems, but their state of mind and their actions functions within Ibsen's writing in a form of psychological up-to-date realism. As with Ibsen, in Munch's art, the deep-seated dramatic conflict is more often realistic than romantic. After all, Ashes present a modern couple. He gives us both a primeval myth and a narrative of the specific new gender relation and women's emancipation of his own time. It's dealing with the new roles of men and women. In their contrasting gestures of shame and self-assertion, the figures have changed their roles. The man is here shameful, but the woman is not so afraid of her instincts and seems not to so much as the man a victim of her own emotions and instincts. Munch reflects on the women's emancipation in the following way in a text from 1929. And here is also my own translation, so excuse for that. Kierkegaard lived in the time of Faust, Don Juan, Mozart. Don Juan, that was the man who seduces the innocent girl. I myself have lived in a time of transition, in the middle of women's emancipation. Then it became the woman who seduced, lured, and cheated the male, the time of Carmen. No, the man became the weakest, Munch writes. So Munch is working around all these literary and well-known figures from mythology at the time Ashes was made, and I think we can say that the painting is dense with references of this kind, but his pictures almost always have an ambiguous character. The action cannot be directly identified via specific writing sources, neither his own nor the writings of others. As I said, an alternative title for the painting was After the Fall, but Munch almost never used such kind of coded titles on his artworks, and Ashes was there as a title from the beginning. In his text material, we find the following that can be related to the title Ashes. The elderly ones were right when they said that love was a flame. It leaves behind, just as the flame, only a pile of ashes. And also another writing that is related to the title. I felt that Oslo lay on the earth as a pile of ashes. In a presentation of his Frieze of Life in 1902, Munch hung ashes in a central position, using it to introduce a group of paintings about the flowering and passing of love. Most of the love scenes in the frieze is taking place outdoor. The seashore and the forest were kind of a leitmotif, as I said earlier. As we have seen, there are several references to the forest in Munch's own writings. Interesting is the following comment about the Frieze of Life project. I was thinking about making a drawing of a kind of an art chapel of these paintings. I'm thinking of a round hall. The style should be inspired from spruce and pine forest, kind of a Gothic. A few years later, he writes something similar. This is in 1910. I suggest to build a pavilion with architecture from the Norwegian spruce and pine forest, a kind of large forest hall. A round hall with pillars and galleries, there the Frieze of Life could be installed. In many of Munch's paintings, symbolic figures melt together with, or in one way or another, are related to a forest, a stand of trees, or actually more often just a singular tree. This we can observe in his different variations of the woman in 3 stages, for instance. The tree here becomes a symbol of life spirit, affirming and erotic feelings. Eroticism is not so explicit in ashes, though in the related drawings that we have looked upon, it is more directly expressed. We now look at 2 paintings from the beginning of the 1900s by Munch. As you can see, they have motifs related to ashes. The composition has been changed a bit. Here the couple are naked and they are placed on the border between the forest and the shoreline. They are no longer in a deep dark forest, but the forest is still included. And then I have kind of a little epilogue, because I first was thinking about talking about the forest in a broader sense, so I just wanted to show you a couple of images of Munch's, because when you come to the end of the 90s and around 1900, he then gradually began to move away from symbolist depictions of human existence and then began to make pure landscape paintings. And then you have some series where he paints the forest. So here he takes in many ways the same artistic point of view as his Nordic contemporaries in the years around 1900. The similarities are particularly noticeable in his treatment of the trees and the forest subjects, which are especially common around 1900, like we know it from Gallen Kallela, Pekka Haaland, Prince Eugene, Helmer Oslund, Gustav Fjestad, Harald Solberg, just to mention some of the most important and well-known. In paintings like this White Night and this dark spruce forest that you saw here, the forest stands out as an unspoiled, harmonious wilderness, and these works relate to the evocative and soulful landscape paintings that characterize so many Nordic symbolist landscapes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We are now proceeding with a presentation by Phyllis Connors, and the presentation is entitled British Aestheticism and the Symbolic Art of the Baltic Littoral. And about Phyllis also, she is an independent scholar currently living in London. And she has recently presented a paper on the aesthetics of Walter Pater and the art of Čiurlionis at the International Walter Pater Conference. And she was a Fulbright scholar at the University of London in Anglo-American literature as well. So, welcome, Phyllis. We are very keen on to know about your presentation. Thank you.
Just going to open it. A delight to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation. The talks thus far have been so very stimulating. I just want to announce ahead of time that the paintings that I chose for this paper are the ones that are on view here, rather than the ones of Trullonis that best fit the argument. So you would have some immediacy of impression here. I chose the ones that are hanging now. Aestheticism is not an autonomous development with English art. Rather, it is a cosmopolitan outlook that is embedded in the artistic practices and theoretical underpinnings of an emerging critique of art and culture. Undoubtedly, Walter Pater is the chief theorist of the aesthetic movement. In his 1873 collection of essays, published as Studies in the History of Renaissance, he subtly works on three temporal planes, elaborating the meaning of the Hellenic spirit, tracing its revival from the late Middle Ages in France to the Germany of Winckelmann and Goethe, and assessing modern aesthetic values based on individualism and the primacy of sensory experience. Pater's most obvious and ardent disciples are Oscar Wilde and Aubrey Beardsley, both of whom had an impact on the direction of decadence and symbolism in continental and Baltic art and literature at the fin de siècle. This presentation will map the aestheticist contours of two artists from the Baltic littoral, M.K. Trullonis of Lithuania and Nikolai Trik from Estonia. The discussion focuses on paintings currently on the exhibition. Pater's aestheticism, I will demonstrate, launched a radically new methodologies for art appreciation, modes of experience and articulation that through a network of dissemination and influence that I will explicate, informed the symbolist art of the Baltic region. Mir Ishkustva, or World of Art, a St. Petersburg art and literary magazine, emerges as the crucial link between British aestheticism and its heirs in the Baltic littoral, especially Trullonis and Trik. The first phase was initiated by Alexander Benoit in the late 1880s as a schoolboy society known as the Nevsky Peckwickians, and quickly became a movement in the 1890s similar to European Art Nouveau. In 1899, the World of Art magazine was founded with Diaghilev as the first editor. In 1910, Nikolai Roerich became the new chairman. Within the World of Art, circles and salons of the intelligentsia, the British journals, the Yellow Book, and the Savoy were widely distributed. It has been argued that the Pater-inflected examples of Beardsley and Wilde contributed to the actual formulation of the World of Art journal. Certainly the presence of English art predominated over French in the early issues. The group organized many exhibitions, both within and outside Russian borders, energized by two desires: to promulgate art for art's sake, the cri de coeur of the conclusion to Pater's Renaissance, and to convey disgust with the anti-aesthetic nature of modern industrial society. Besides the World of Art group, Benoit's Salon, also known as Benoit's Thursdays, offers another link to Pater. Especially noteworthy among the guests was the poet, composer, novelist Mikhail Kuzmin, hailed as the Russian Oscar Wilde. Kuzmin wielded significant influence in shaping Baltic modernism. Like Čiurlionis, he often presented at the evenings of contemporary music. Kuzmin and Konstantin Somov, considered to be another Beardsley, were thought to be inseparable friends. Somov exhibited with Čiurlionis and became an integral part of Čiurlionis's cultural life in St. Petersburg. Kuzmin's novel Wings, published in 1905, was heavily influenced by Peter's writings. The novelist's protagonist, Strup, espouses a Peterian credo and Hellenic ideals. Other Peterian echoes are heard in Kuzmin's use of the word pulsation, trip, indicating intense aesthetic sensation. This lexicon is of pivotal importance in the conclusion of Peter's Renaissance, which Arthur Symonds aptly called the manifesto of the aesthetic school. There is no doubt that Kuzmin was familiar with Peter's writings. Moreover, he was close friends with Janida Vingarova, a major translator of Peter's works, who fully appreciated Peter's importance in late Victorian intellectual life. Peter's influence on Kuzmin is most evident in Kuzmin's celebrated essay on beautiful clarity, published in the journal Apollon in 1910. This essay is a direct reworking of Peter's 1888 masterwork style. From this network of Russian intellectuals, during the first decade of the 20th century, Čiurlionis's familiarity with Peterian principles emerged. Čiurlionis's intermedial paintings vividly illustrate this cultural trend in Russian and Baltic aesthetic life. There are two themes that I wish to explore in relation to Peter's presence in the world of art. That is interpreted in the journal and it aspires various individuals. The first theme is the heightened experience offered in the aesthetic moment or work of art, a combination of individual sensibility, historical contingencies, and sensory pleasure. As Peter's famous dictum in this essay says, in the School of Giorgione, he promises that all art aspires to the condition of music. The musically minded paintings of Čiurlionis illustrate the condition of music in the conflation of matter and form. The second theme explores the tensions between cosmopolitanism and nationalism, highly profiled in geopolitical debate throughout 19th century Europe, but brought to the fore in Peter's essay, Joachim du Bellay. I will use what Julia Kristeva and many other critics call intertextuality to ponder Peter's use of two French poets to dramatize how individualism is to be understood in relation to cosmopolitanism and nationalism. The paintings of Nikolai Trik exemplify intertextuality, borrowing from and adapting sources, especially the Estonian folkloric epic Kalevipoeg, in order to further the cause of Estonian nationalism, which is consciously embedded in European cosmopolitanism. Peter's presence, I am suggesting, underlies the intermedial ethos of Čiurlionis' art. I think I missed the page here. Peter first established his essay in 1877, the same year of the now notorious Grosvenor Gallery exhibition, featuring Whistler's painting with musical titles such as Symphony and Nocturne, titles that were inspired by Paul Mance, the French critic, who was in 1863 the first to appreciate Whistler's radical methods. It is not coincidental that Peter's aesthetic criticism deployed a musical lexicon to convey personal sensations as the most important criteria for artistic perception. Regarding Giorgione, Peter admires how he dwells upon scenes of music and performance and observes that music is the typically or ideally consummate art. the object of the great Understreben of all art. To explain Giorgioni's well-known pastoral Fête de Chambet, Pater cites not his own conception of Understreben, but that of Dante Gabriel Rossetti's poem, A Venetian Pastoral. In referring to the delightful sonnet, Pater fuses the Renaissance past with the Victorian present, painting, poetry, and music. This process is also highlighted in the discussion of Trieck's paintings in relationship to Vibeke. Pater, like Hegel, regards music as having no content. Its rhythm becomes part of the pulse of a radical subjectivity for perception in artist, listener, and reader. What does it mean to aspire to the condition of music? For Pater, sound is both the form and the content. Thus, music is a pure art form that escapes of a differentiating intelligence and becomes an art of which is a matter of pure perception. By melding form and content, music lives within time and can also influence or alter one's subjectivity. Pater refers to this as the interpenetration of the matter or subject of a work of art with the form of it, a condition realized absolutely only in music, as the condition to which every form of art is perpetually aspiring. This in turn collapses the distinctions between objects and viewers. Sound enters a space of continual movement and subjectivity is radicalized. Giorgioni's paintings depict space as an arrested moment, an exquisite pause in time. In Pater's words, they absorb past and future in intense consciousness of the present. In Pater's ekphrastic rendering of Fête de Chambet, he imagines the sound of falling water. It mingles with the dying strains of music, creating a sense of melancholy and lyric sensuousness. The presence of water, the well or marble-rimmed pool, the drawing or pouring of water, as the woman pours it from a pitcher, perhaps to the cool sound as it falls, blent with the music of the pipes, suggestive as that of music itself. What I'm calling the musical paintings of Trelawny are testimony to Pater's textual and cultural reach. Vytautas Landsbergis, a renowned musicologist, laid the groundwork for an interpretation of Trelawny's paintings in this way. More recently, the Lithuanian art historian Rasa Žukienė has broadened the interpretations of Trelawny's art. Expanding on their work, I am suggesting that Trelawny absorbed Paterian ideas to create an evocative style of painting which bridges symbolism to abstract art. His works conflate the ideals of music, of art, matter, and form by applying the musical principles of rhythm and leitmotif to a graphic spatial organization of painting. His principal means of expression is the line, which in the manner of Aubrey Beardsley's rhythmic quality of line. Trelawny does not seek to create color equivalencies, as did Kandinsky in Scriben. Instead, he works toward the formal construction of concrete images, with the graphic linear principle being of prime importance. Trelawny's art emphasizes structural elements. Motifs abstracted from his reality are arranged in a landscape of the imagination, their composition based on the structural pieces of the musical piece. The second panel is a monumental composition that can be interpreted as a microcosm of the Allegro, the first one, or its prelude. The upper part of a planetary sphere recalls a medieval mappa mundi. The earth resembles an almost childlike rendering of forest and trees punctuated by a sinuous ocean system. The hazy clouds of the cosmos are united with the fertile earth underneath, bold shafts of light whose vertical rays emit their own energy from a nearly undetectable pyramid. suggest the creation of the world, a theme that Čiurlionis would return to evocatively in his masterworks Rex and the Sonata of the Pyramids. The third picture, the scherzo, is full of golden light. We just passed him, sorry. The third picture, the scherzo, is full of golden light and playfulness, as is the corresponding movement of the musical sonata form. Delicate red and red-orange tulips emerge from the green insular landmass that insinuates across serene water, with its mirror reflection of a calm sky dotted with diaphanous clouds. The tulip forms, emblematic of Čiurlionis' entire oeuvre, are folk motifs from the ancient Lithuanian pagan era, found in wooden distaffs and wayside shrines. So you can see exactly where he got them from. Tulips arranged in an elegant, almost semicircular pattern fade into the distance, as does the harmony within the design of the sonata notation. Light and dark motifs are directly reflected from pictorial surface to musical score and back again. The tulips complete the circle as shape the direction of the water, leading to the filigree bridge in the upper left distance, dotted with tulips that becomes primitive star designs. The whimsical bridge in the foreground, seemingly suspended by a forest clump of trees, adds to the central motif of the music and is reflected in a curvaceous manner in a lighter repetition in the background. The flight of playful and colorful butterflies. Emphasizes the elegance and lightness of the composition, an appropriate counterpart to its musical form. The thin crescent moon hangs in a celestial stratosphere, seemingly as the outer orb of a deeply discernible, barely discernible sun. As a motif, it will repeat it in the companion painting finale, an integral part of the pattern and form of the sonata. This painting resembles a silenced bell. Examined carefully, the musical object has produced its own sound. The emanations have taken the concrete form of a spider's web that evokes the energy and visual pleasure of symmetry, fragility, and elegance. Perhaps the silenced bell eclipses the sun seen in the previous companion panels. The design on the outer rim of the bell evokes scenes from the previous 3 panels, with the central disc in rays following the pattern of the Andante panel. The far-off sun and crescent moon are reminiscent of Marian rituals in Christianity and the Egyptian cult of Isis, both of which Čiurlionis would have known. Behind the web, in the depths of the night and the universe, we can see the glimmer of faraway stars and other suns. 3 kings are listlessly seated on their thrones, echoing the empty thrones in the previous panels in the rim of the bell. Faintly behind the web, the shadow of an angel is detected as intermediary for earth, humanity, and God. The finale affirms the continuity and music of the universe. Nikolai Trip's creative directions reflect the Janus-faced tendency of early Northern European artists to emphasize a nascent nationalism, all the while longing for a window on the West. Already part of the subtext of the World of Art group, Pater's The Renaissance functions as a crucial reference point for interpreting the social, political, and aesthetic values in Trip's paintings Le Nook and Battle. Both canvases conveyed allusions to different ages in the process of history. Here in the path of myth and folklore, Trick is making the Kaleviboy epic the intellectual and spiritual referent for the flat surface, inscribed with rhythmic line and vibrant color as an autonomous vehicle for visual pleasure. This is not merely an illustration for the epic poem, but a singular artwork that articulates the historical and spiritual values of the Estonian people. Triep's cosmopolitanism comes to bear in his adoption of a continental European painterly technique and genre. The triptych from Lenuc is reminiscent of Netherlandish painting. The vivid colors and mosaic-like shapes are typical of Byzantine architecture and Gothic stained glass. But the problem of fusing national consciousness within a cosmopolitan framework is not a new one. Matthew Podolsky points out Walter Pater's critique of nationalism in the Renaissance is part of an argument defending the necessity of aesthetic cross-cultural and worldly influences. In the Florentine Renaissance, Pater discerns a revival of the Hellenic spirit, and by means of which then contemporary major artists, writers, and intellectuals embraced and enhanced national, historical, and religious traditions. Here is, of course, his second one, Battle. In Pater's signature essay on Leonardo da Vinci, he claims that La Gioconda sums up all the modes and thoughts of life. She is, to quote Pater's haunting prose, the animalism of Greece, the lust of Rome, the mysticism of the Middle Ages, the return of the pagan world. She is older than the rocks, yet the embodiment of Leda and St. Anne alike. Pater complicates further the Victorian view of the Renaissance in the essay Joachim du Bellay by defining the relationship of Europe and the traditions of ancient Greece and Rome, and the current conflicted relationships among modern nation states and their traditions. The debate between nationalism and cosmopolitanism is embodied by the two early French poets, Du Bellay and Ronsard, associated with nascent French nationalism. Du Bellay did not absorb the classics to make him national and modern. Pater argues, instead, he turned to resources of his own comely tongue. Du Bellay can only become more French by way of foreign influences. In contrast, Ronsard's poetry opens up the borders of language and poetic discourse, mixing vernacular expression and traditions of poetic form, combining ancient and modern traditions, classical and modern languages. He is charmed, Pater imagines, by a certain number of Greek words and a desire more exquisite than that of the older French verse, the swallow-like motion of rhyme. Both French poets demonstrate that there is no national unity without a prior worldly hybridity. Bart Pusha elaborates on this theme in his valuable essay on Estonian multiculturalism. Nationalism and cosmopolitanism exist in a symbiotic relationship. Intertextuality provides a lens for examining the integral parts of that relationship as seen in Trick's renditions of Lenuc and Battle. Both of Trick's paintings are examples of what Wittgenstein refers to as family resemblances, in alluding to Estonian and Viking mythology for their iconographic reference. In conclusion, I have included here Munch's tapestry design, an example of recalling Viking folklore for tapestry, and Rorik's painting, who was the teacher of Trick, which displays his affinity for dazzling color, also reflective of folk art. All of the artists on exhibition are the direct heirs of British aestheticism in some way. In Pater's memorable words, the splendid Baltic Symbolist provides, as Pater says, experience itself, aesthetic encounters in which new waves of emotion are sure to surface. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for your very exciting and interesting papers. This material definitely needs more time to think about. But for the starting point, I would sketch here some general thoughts or questions when thinking about our umbrella topic here as the landscape of the soul, which combines nature and everything that is going on in our soul, mind and heart, etc. And so I would like to ask you if we put Baltic symbolism in the context of 20th century modern Western European art, then is there a relationship between nature and somehow different? And do the Western European artists reflect nature or the impacts of the nature on their soul somehow differently than, for example, Baltic authors as Estonians, Latvian, Lithuanians, and also Nordic artists? So kind of a general starting point about the landscapes and how...
But
maybe
excuse me, you
Vibeke.
asked about Baltic, or in general? Or?
Yes, I think that, do you see a distinction between the way of thinking when talking about this soul landscape theme compared with the Western European context, as what the Western European artists are doing and how it is in the Baltic so-called soul landscapes? Is there a difference or?
Yeah, and then you include Norway in the Baltic.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes,
okay.
yes.
Then I'm on. Because yeah, I don't know that much about Baltic art history, or yeah. Any difference? Yeah, but I think what I have been, my intention here and my interest was kind of saying something about that. That the artists, they of course use, they are symbolists and they can kind of paint whatever they like and what they imagine and their fantasy and dreams and whatever. But even though a painter like Munch, he used very much the surroundings that he knows from before. And for instance, the use of the forest, I think for many, at least Norwegian and also Finnish artists that I know a little bit about, that all these artists, they knew how it felt to be in a huge infinite forest in a way. So that's an important experience. So it's using this experience but making symbols of it in a way. So that's and also with Munch, the shoreline, and these are traits of the landscape in Norway in a way. So that's the difference. If you ask about, for instance, the Southern Europe, if you go to Italy, France, so maybe that would be, and you also have the different. Of course, you have forests. It's also in France and Germany and so on, but you have a very specific in Norway, the pine forests. So that's something quite dark and dense, and yeah, you have all this, and you also find this in, as I mentioned, in the mythology. It's very important, the mythology of in Nordic mythology.
I would say the like. Also in Trelawnis's art, he very much references the forest as part of the mythological emergence of the Lithuanian mentality. Especially from their pagan ways and their worship of the oak tree as more or less part of their mythology. Their his constant reference, and other Lithuanian artists as well that are on display here, their worship almost of the countryside, their beautiful fields, the emergence of earth and sky is almost a mystical experience.
Thank you. Would you like to also comment?
I'm not sure that I have I'm not sure that I completely understand the question, but I'm also, the trouble that I have is that I've never really looked for in this area for those sorts of trends, those sorts of arches over generalizing approaches in one area versus another. So I'm not sure that I have all that much to contribute to that question. I mean, it is true that in terms of views of nature, if that's what we're talking about, natural landscapes, that there are, of course, differences inflected by sort of particular national icons that appear in certain views of nature, a certain kind of tree, for instance, or something like that. But I don't think that I have. I don't think that I have a pointed contribution to your question. So.
Okay. Maybe we can find a better contact with the next comment. I was thinking about this humanization of nature that you also somehow pointed in your presentation, how the human emotions are projected to the nature and the nature is seen as a human being. So that is something people love to do, I think, when we think about nowadays also, for example, about the nature documentaries where all the animals even are portrayed as human beings, and the voiceover is saying us what they might think and how their relationships are, and I wanted to ask, what is your opinion? How much do we see in art this kind of humanization of nature, and when and how are the artists interested in reflecting nature without trying to compare it with humans?
I do not think there are, I actually do not recall at the moment the paintings you have here, because I'm more have in my mind the paintings of Trelawny's that you had in Paris, but anthropomorphism is a constant recurring theme and image in Trelawny's painting, and of course he humanizes nature in that way through his anthropomorphic images. Now I'm trying to think about what we looked at with you yesterday. I think also too you have, if it's not a bit off your direct question here, looking at the angel that was chosen for this exhibition, that's very interesting. That very much shows the link between heaven and earth, and this angel image as the intermediary link, as also it is in Christianity, which, you know, Trelawny's embraced, as opposed to the pagan history of Lithuania. Of course, he dabbles over in that as well. But here you have an intermediary between earth and sky, and a magnificently beautiful landscape with the very obvious image to us from the Christian tradition of the angel, who's also a seer. And again, in a way, emphasizes the direction of individuality, emphasis for individuality that comes along with the aspirations toward nationalism. I hope that is a bit of an insight. How about you?
Would you like to comment about the humanization of the nature and the kind of acting people, painters, artists love to do in symbolism very much?
Yeah, I mean, well, I think, I mean, there are different ways of interpreting humanization. Certainly, I can think of examples a little bit along the lines of the Nielsen Nielsen's that I showed, of the nature becoming, in some sense, a map of impressions, a map of the mind in a way. And that has often, or was often, a useful metaphor for exploring the significance that lay behind materiality, or beyond it, or above it, or however one wants to propose it. So that there are several examples. I mean, it is fairly common for nature to be used as an exploratory sort of medium for symbolist concerns of representation and what representation does to what it is that's being represented. I mean, I can certainly see that, yeah, certainly.
Yes, thank you. And one more general question, when we can have good questions from all the listeners. I was thinking about the color, because when thinking about the exhibition, we have here also a very large amount of artists have used painting as their medium. It is like we can't, we need to face the analyzing the color, and in which means they used color to tell about their soul landscapes, how it was done, and in which means, what you have found interesting for you in that.
Well, of course, I mean, one thing that color does is, insofar as it indicates different registers of light and different registers of atmosphere, it participates in surface experimentations that can help to remove or associate something from or to or with reality, or with perceived visual reality. And in that sense, color was a useful tool for symbolists to sort of position themselves vis-a-vis the direct representation of what they were looking at, in order to indicate how they wanted us to relate to it. Right? If that's what you have in mind. Yeah.
Maybe Vibeke also about Munch and usage of
of
color.
the same, that I think they use the color in general, at least for Norwegian artists from this same period as Edvard Munch. They use the color in landscape painting to kind of get a distance from reality, even though it is it's very obvious that it is trees and forests and landscapes, but they enhance the color, so you have more extreme. It's not naturalistic coloring. So that was, for instance, if you think about Harald Solberg, Vinternatt or the Winter Night in the mountains, very famous Norwegian iconic painting with this blue night, and we also saw this white night. Actually, Munch calls this, the last picture I showed, he called it, the title is White Night, but when we look at it, it's quite blue. But I think what he tried there, as I read it, is try to express how does it feel to get out in the winter time. It's, it's white, the snow, and then you have this special light, and I think he's very successful in this white night with bringing this feeling. Mm-hmm. And then he used blue to express a white night, because he was very good with colors and knew how to express this feeling.
Yes, thank you. We would like to have any more questions about the presentations directly to our performers.
Well, thank you all for very interesting papers. My question actually goes also to Vibeke. And although you said there are many possible interpretations, I was very fascinated by this idea of this main picture of your talk as a kind of invariant of the Adam and Eve tale, whereby we could also interpret forest as a kind of paradise lost. And as you surely all know, forest became an important national symbol also for Germany, and slightly later also for Russia in the 19th century. And since you namely emphasized the importance of pine forest, and this reminded me of an American environmental historian Jane Koslow's recent book, Hard Pine Russia, where she very much emphasizes the joint contribution of artists, writers, and scientists in constructing, namely the pine forest as the national symbol for the Russians, but she also connects it very closely with the development of forestry and thereby with the environmental protection. So I was wondering whether in Norway you can also link this kind of valorization of the forest with some sort of environmental concerns.
Oh, today, you mean?
No, around Munch's time. Around the time that Munch was, namely because that's the, in Russia, for example, it's the late 19th, early 20th century when this kind of valorization of the forest as a national symbol, it's created in culture, in research, but it also very closely relates to the development of forestry and also to environmental protection.
I don't know about that from that time, actually, I have to say. Maybe it was a topic, but for me, it's, I don't know. Yeah, but of course, it has been and still is an important industry for Norway, and so we have a kind of always have a relation to forest, both as a working place. You also find later works by Munch. As I said, he was more and more making pure landscape painting, but actually also in the 20s and 30s he made paintings where you see what you call foresters or working in the woods, chopping the trees, or what, yeah, I don't know the English word, but you know, people that work actually have their workplace in the woods or forests. But yeah, so.
I would like to ask Vibeke about a certain formal, morphological detail in the ashes, which is not that, I think, usual for Munch's painting. There is a tree trunk on the left-hand side, partially cut off by the frame, which transforms in a kind of an inner frame, which is also only partially shown. Do you have an idea how to interpret that? Or, I mean, it's a purely formal device, a compositional device, or it maybe bears some symbolic meaning?
Yeah, a very interesting question, and it's a little bit mystical in one way, but I think it's a kind of decorative element. It's and it makes kind of a frame, so it helps the staging, the situation with the couple. It gives a kind of distance to the couple, so it's staging. But it also this detail. It looks like it's looks a little bit like ashes. So you can also think about it as wood that has been burnt, like I had these references to ash heaps, and so that's also but I think this this decorative element, Art Nouveau, the line around, and that's also, I find it interesting. I showed this Gerhard Munthe watercolor, where you saw this wooden frame that he had painted around his watercolor, the depiction of the black apples, and I think that's typical of the time in a way. So it's and I think in Ashes this makes the picture more. I think Ashes is very much in between. It's very much on the edge of not being realistic in a way. It's very staged, or what to say. So kind of he presents us for this couple and the forest so that we can really think about what's going on. Yeah.
Thank you everyone for, excuse me, for great talks. I think I would like to continue that line of thought because, well, I do understand that you're interested in iconological references and myths and and so on. But I was also really struck by the materiality of ashes and that abstract element there, and which you mentioned, but also over the woman's head, there's also this strange field, and also the body of the man in the left corner is also this abstracted, strange field. And there has been some attention in art history about that, about abstraction as potential fields or potential images. Dario Gamboni, for example, has paid attention to that. And I was thinking about the elemental imaginary, about in relation to ashes, which indicate a process of the fire, and if that is something that is that like a problem in your interpretation, which emphasize the references to literature and myths, or can it contribute to your theory?
Excuse me, could you say what?
Yeah. So sorry, that was a long.
It was a little bit long.
Started daydreaming about this this interesting image. But what about those abstracted fields that are not clear references to myths or iconological
No, but as
things?
I tried to express, I think the ashes is quite different in a way from many of the other works in the Frieze of Life, because it's this, you have this decorative element and it's very, very abstracted, and I have this but what I try to express is that it's both this very here and now modern couple. It's very much situated in Munch's own time, this situation, and as I also was touched upon, but I think also behind this all this you have all this mythological thinking that I'm sure that Munch was aware of and he read, and as we saw in the drawings, that's also contribute. But I'm not sure of, if I understood your question right. But the painting in itself is quite abstract. So maybe that's what you're asking about, is that also contribute to that abstraction. So it's this ambiguity that it's both a couple that is in the very front of you and it's here and now, but it's also very abstract. So I think it's very fascinating with that painting.
Yes, thank you for the papers that were fascinating, and also the wonderful images that you all show. So I just wanted to contribute or to add maybe some another layer to this discussion, because I think that it is important to remember that at the end of the 19th century, what was discussed a lot by scientists was the psychology. So the psychology of vision, and also the psychology of nations. So I think that that is the mental thinking, or the turn of the artist towards expressing the mental conditions of a nation or also a person. It is becoming more and more important. After all, we can also remember that Wölflin's dissertation was on psychology of architecture. So I think this is important to know as a context, international context of ideas that were evolving around this century. Thank you.
Definitely. And one thing that I didn't mention was that I guess it was a little more than a decade after Kairos published 9 Letters on Landscape Painting, he published a book called Psyche, which many people look back at as a source or an inspiration or a precursor of Freud's depth psychology, right? So I mean, there was clearly, it had been developing for a while, and one interesting thing that one sees shortly after 1900 is that all of these phenomena that had been discussed in speculative and unreliable terminology increasingly became sort of systematized in terms of the terminology that was applied to them, so that eventually that vast thing that was the psyche, which is sort of the source of the humanization often that you're talking about, started to become organized. And that is a major shift intellectually in the context for a lot of this work. Yeah.
Yes, to comment on that, I think that's obvious what you're saying, and when it comes to the Munch research, it has been done quite a lot already. So my thinking here was to try to think a little bit around the mythology and other thoughts instead of bringing in this perspective that has already been written about. But I also think that as our keynote speaker today touched upon this, that the mythology was also kind of a psychology. So you could find inspiration in the same way in these stories.
Hello, I'm sorry I didn't catch all the previous. I came in at the moment, which was very interesting for me when you addressed the role of nature and the humanization of nature, and that sort of started to link in my head with, for example, different both eco-critical and new age discourses, and that put me to formulate a question: what would you consider to be the most outspoken in this art of the turn of the previous century for us now? In a way, like this eco and nature thematics resonates. Would there be any other thematics which would resonate nearly in the same way?
I'm not sure if I follow. What did you mean that? Can you just say it shortly? That
humanization of nature as a concept is very important, I guess, also for culture now.
Yeah.
Would there be any other key concept within the field of your study and the field of this conference you could like put besides this theme of nature and ecology and humanization?
Well, we did have an important example of one from Dr. Liis this morning about, that there is a form of romantic nationalism that is re-emerging today, that we can certainly trace back to the 19th century. There's almost always a place for degeneration of some kind or other. I mean, that is one thing that has never gone away. But I'm not sure that there probably is an example of something that is as pointed. My guess is that if we hand a microphone to Patricia Berman, she'll tell us what it is.
Thank you for this panel. I found this all incredibly inspiring. And in light of Dr. Liis's keynote today, too, I had a complicated question. First, I'll say that in response to what you were just asking, there's a vast amount of national romantic poetry in Norway that valorizes the forest and valorizes the landscape. As Bjørnstjerne Bjørnson wrote, that it's the perfect home for the Norwegian people. So it is a kind of a sort of an eco-critical point of view, I guess, that the landscape itself is then reconstituted literally as home, and the Norwegians as a family living in the home. So there's a lot of rhetoric that will locate people in the land. The land is valorized as a kind of a biome for humans. and a psychological space for humans. And given that, I guess here's my question. I'm going to try to make sense of it. I'm thinking of Mika Ball's notion of surface tension, in which the surface of an object, when you're looking at a painting, you are obviously having a sort of a relationship to that surface, but the surface is standing in for so many other things, and the surface is a condensation of so many things, or a concretion of so many things that sit behind the surface. And one of the things I was really interested in hearing from all of you is the way in which landscape in some way or another, or nature, is valorized or involves eroticism, or involves mysticism, or involves something that's extra-human and some extra-human perception. So given the fact that already the landscape is invested with something that's extraordinary, and then a work of art is in some way creating an analogy to that extraordinary thing, I see the surface, I think you're getting at something really important about symbolist painting. And I think, Thor, I was really very taken with your interpretation of a kind of a psychic relationship to both the thing that's beyond the painting, the surface itself, and then the self. And I'm not sure how to ask the question, but I think that there's a particular way of maybe thinking about symbolist painting surfaces, or print surfaces, or drawing surfaces that operate in this curious experimental arena of the mind. And I just wonder if you could sort of comment on that, if you can follow even what I'm sort of saying. Like, the subject is valorized, the surface is valorized, you're valorized, everything's activated in a fresh way.
Yeah, that's, if you thought it was tough to formulate that question, imagine trying to answer it. That's absolutely, no question about it. I mean, that is, I think there's definitely a potential there, and perhaps it's also in the case of symbolism, although, you know, it's dangerous to regard the idea of symbolism as a reified thing that always had a matching goal every time. But there is this general idea of looking beyond materiality, and there may be some relationship between the tendency in symbolism to assume that the visual reality is not actually what's being painted. It may be that makes the surface into this phenomenon that is that applies to every level of representation. It's not just a single surface. It's us. It is the literal surface, and then it is what is allegedly behind the surface of the objects on the surface, and then behind that surface, right? I mean, so it just keeps going, and it may be the symbolist distrust of surfaces as sources of meaning that allow for the surface of the painting to have this much more complicated life, right? And that's fun to think about. And then it's also, it may also be that allows psychology. And, you know, we have to be also a little careful about psychology. Psychology is the study of human behavior. We're talking about something much more specific than that, right? It may be that that thing about symbolism and about its relationship to surface that also made it so well suited to the sort of depth psychology, the plumbing of what lay behind thought as much as what lay behind objects, right? That animated so much of the sort of well, certainly Nielsen, but then also so much of the symbolism, whether it was, you know, Rosicrucianism, the sort of the new Catholicism, or whether it was something that had nothing to do with a religious thought at all, but had to do with an emotional or intellectual quest, or, you know, or experiment. That may be a way in which those things could fit together. Does that? Yeah. up at the top.
Can I also, I'm not sure if I understood you right, but I think when you think of, if you meant the contact between the viewer and the theme and the nature in the topic. I think what is very important, of course, and obvious in Munch's painting is this frontality, like in Ashes, where it's very striking. And this makes this contact that she's almost, she looks at us and tells us something. And I think when it comes to nature and the way Munch uses nature, it's not like the trees and the stones and all these things they are not coming humanized. It's always in a combination with figures or humans. And then the nature gets a meaning. So like here, it's the forest in the background that tells me about this irrational scenery, what has going on. Yeah, so that's important for. If instead, like let us think it was happening in a cafe or some kind of room or another environment, it would be a different painting.
I'd like to make a comment about that as well, just briefly. When a friend asked me, well, what really is symbolism? Well, I had to think of something short, quick, and to the point. So going on his idea here and the other ideas expressed, I see it, or I simplify it here as going from outside the mind to inside the mind, and you now have a rendering of what would be inside your mind. And all of the symbolists here, definitely paintings on display here, I think in some way have very much penetrated that idea, but in different ways. Not to go back just to Trelawney's, but you see the surfaces of his painting very much exemplifying what he's thinking, what he's feeling. But in addition to that, you have there his trying to create for you, the viewer, a consciousness of what was the history of Lithuania from its myth, from its pagan era, from its mythology, to its folklore, and then on up to what the present day was, and nation building. All of those things are threaded together that create a very deep sense of consciousness that are then, as I said, reworked in his musical stuff. But there is so many other of his paintings that exemplify the threading of all of those layers of consciousness that definitely expand the idea of psychological experience, but really add to the idea of the very essence of symbolism. So I just wanted to add that.
Yes, I know we need to finish pretty soon, but okay, I also wanted to make a comment, but after you, maybe.
Well, thank you very much. In line with the previous question, it struck me suddenly that besides the surface tension of the paintings, there also seems to be, and this is a purely informative question to all three of you, a crisis of perspective in this style. The blind girl in the landscape was the most perspectival picture of it all, and you brought it out very well in positioning her. But for the rest, the wood, and this goes back to the Arthurian Forest Perilous, is a place without a visible vanishing point. People are really lost in there. It's very deep, but it doesn't have perspective. And Corleone seems to be oniric because there is depth, but there is no perspective to the depth. So as an amateur in art history, I'm wondering, is there a crisis of perspective, and is there a political or ideological component to this loss of perspective in late 19th century art?
I don't know if it is a crisis. Maybe someone else can answer that. But I think that this leaving out this perspective is giving the room comes closer when you look at the painting. You are almost in the same room as the couple, especially in this painting. Then, if I talk about Ashes still, but also I think you can generalize that a little bit. That you have. You're narrowing the space, and there you are more in dialogue with the viewer. But when it comes to Munch, he also uses perspective, and like we saw in The Voice, you have the fjord in behind, and yeah. Excuse me? Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
I think I would be reticent to associate I wouldn't call it a crisis either. I would call it experimentation or rejection or redefinition, replacement. Because but that's just semantic. But I mean, right. But one thing I will say is that I'd be reticent to assign it to the 1890s because there had been people either removing or trying to find an alternative to perspective before that, right? I think it fits more widely into a modernist project of finding a different way to make a lasting image. So it fit very nicely into the Symbolist program, but it was a good 20 years old at that point. That is just the idea of getting rid of perspective or replacing it in some way. So it was already there.
Okay. I know we are out of time, but I would like to go back a little bit to the theme suggested by Hanno Sohns. I also agree that there are many kind of eco-critical and post-human ideas in the air nowadays, and it somehow turns those symbolistic landscape when we think about, for example, of the landscapes of Konradmägi relevant again. So it's always a longing for a nature, for a landscape without humans. There are no just like elements depicted of the human world. And so it's like maybe people of nowadays society find a very good contact when they share that kind of ecological, critical thinking about what the human society has caused for the nature. So, I think we don't have any time to discuss, but let's continue during the lunch. Thank you.